So this will be now question answer session. As you know that we had the great viewpoints presented. So the question answer session would be very brief. We would like to limit it to 5 so that we can start the next session on time. There would not be any break in between the sessions, 2 sessions, and then we'll have a lunch break. So now we'll start questions. Anyone can raise a question. The question can be directed to a specific panelist or in general. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, get up and it is audible. Yeah, go ahead.
Ali Giovanni, question for Professor Mohammed. Can you speak a little bit about the Afghanistan index that's working and the observations of some of the indicators? What indicators are going well? What are not going so well? What indicators appear to be going a certain way, but we need to be careful about them?
Thank you, my friend, and I doubt I'll say anything too earth-shattering in my answer, but I appreciate your recognition of the Afghanistan index that my colleague Ian Livingston worked so hard on in particular. And I think in broad brush, the good news on the security front is the resilience, the size, the increased training and equipment, and the willingness to fight of the Afghan security forces. The bad news is the resilience of the enemy and the ongoing challenge posed by the enemy, and the fact that after this great surge of NATO and Afghan and other international effort militarily in the last 4 years, we have not meaningfully weakened the insurgency. Yes, there are places it's weaker. Yes, there are many of its leaders that have been taken down, but the overall ability of the Taliban to create violence has not been meaningfully effective. So that's the bad news. On the economic development side, again, in broad brush, we have seen as rapid of an improvement in human development indicators in Afghanistan the last dozen years as, frankly, anywhere on the planet that I'm familiar with in the history of development. That's the good news. The bad news is it's happened in the context of pumping in so many resources that we've actually exacerbated a good deal of the corruption, and it's not clear that the institutions in Afghanistan are capable of sustaining or managing this as the international effort draws down. I'm just going to make a couple other very brief points and I'll be done. And I thought the Secretary comments were very, very good. When he raised a couple of things, I think a very brief response is needed for. One is I agree fully that we should not be portraying Afghanistan's current troubles as due to an Indo-Pakistani rivalry. In fact, there was a paper written at Brookings that made such an allegation, and I felt the need to actually challenge my own colleague in that regard. I understood he was making other points as well. It was an intelligent paper in many respects, but it could be misinterpreted or read in a certain way as suggesting that somehow this was the new great game, that India and Pakistan were equally to blame for proxy warfare that was emerging in Afghanistan. I would just like to associate myself with the view that India has not been a culprit. Having said that, I think India still needs to keep thinking hard, as it has been, about how not to do that. And there may be places where, even though India is not at fault, some degree of flexibility on its presence in Afghanistan is worth keeping in mind. For example, I don't think India should have a large bilateral military training program in Afghanistan in the future, because that would predictably exacerbate tensions. It would not be India's fault, but we know how Pakistan could easily react to that. And I also think that it's best that India emphasize more of its efforts in the center, north, and west. Now, I don't want to, of course, that has its own dangers, because then Pakistanis will say you're just helping your Northern Alliance friends, and you don't really care about Afghanistan writ large. On the other hand, if you have to balance between the concerns that Pakistanis will see an Indian presence in the south and east as somehow, a cover for helping insurgencies within Pakistan, I think we have to be sensitive to that. Again, it's not India's fault that Pakistan feels that way, and I won't get into the broader issues in the Indo-Pakistani relationship. But narrowly on this issue, I think we have to be sensitive to the kinds of reactions that we can engender. But I think India's done that. I'm just encouraging my friends to keep doing so. Very briefly, the zero option, as I've said before, I think is a poor idea. The good news is I don't think it's a preferred option by the Obama administration. It's a little bit more of an option than I would like to see under any circumstances. And I've differed with the Obama administration on this point. I don't think it should be even raised. And Lisa and I made arguments to that effect a moment ago. But I don't think you should worry too much that it's our likely preferred preference. And very finally, on the issue of the Taliban, and again, the Secretary raised some valid concerns here, but I do not believe that having seen more than 2,000 of its own soldiers, Marines, and other personnel killed by an enemy that is largely described and summarized as the Taliban, that we are going to be privy to encouraging a deal in which the Taliban would be allowed large swaths of southern and eastern Afghanistan. There's more we can do to assure people that we do not have any such intention. And the Afghan government will have the ultimate decisions here, but I don't think we have any such intention. I just want to be very clear on that.
Thanks for clarifying. I would like to request Mr. Kanwar Sivalji to talk about this very briefly, though, about this impact of and the need of or any rationale behind this bilateral training programs that India is probably interested in.
Well, I'd like to make the larger point that we have been particularly mindful of U.S. concerns and U.S. equities in Afghanistan. And that has constrained a great deal of what we could have done, might have done in the face of provocations by Pakistan. But we felt that our relationship with the United States was much more important than yielding to pressure from internal lobbies to react to Pakistan's provocations in Afghanistan, including the bombing of our embassy and other targets related to India in that country. United States has always been a little had reservations about India's involvement in giving military assistance to the Karzai government. We ourselves are not terribly keen on expanding our military role in Afghanistan because we know we cannot sustain it. And we don't want to get caught in a situation where we begin the process of getting more and more involved in this, and then we would not know where to stop. So what we have always considered reasonable and practical is to give training to the Afghan military, not in Afghanistan, but in India. Pakistan feels very concerned that we are giving training to the Afghan military personnel, and they have been asking Karzai to send Afghan military personnel to Pakistan for their training. We've never told the Kabul government, don't do that. But Karzai has not wanted to send them, and Afghan military officers themselves have not wanted to go to Afghanistan because they don't want to be tainted with the brush of having become ISI potential recruits for Pakistan and Afghanistan. So that's not our problem. Insofar as the numbers are concerned of people we are training, they remain very modest. We're not giving any lethal combat equipment, et cetera, et cetera. With regard to our presence in Pashtun areas, let me make the point, which is not sufficiently made, that our historical ties with Afghanistan have not been beyond the Hindu Kush. They've always been in the Pashtun areas. And there are a lot of commonalities between northwestern India and the Pashtun areas. I remember when I was in power and we had, when I was in office and we had demarches made to us from the Pashtuns that they wanted to revive the trade in dry fruits and fruits from Afghanistan to India, etc. So they wanted us to reduce duties, everything else we did. And now there's very considerable and flourishing trade in dry fruits and fruits from Afghanistan, from the Pashtun areas to India. We've always had our consulates in the Pashtun areas, in Kandahar and in Jalalabad. It was only interrupted when the Taliban were in power. So when the Taliban were removed from power, these consulates were reinstated. So to suggest that we are there or we came there to create problems for Pakistan is very unfair. And finally, I'd like to make the point that if Pakistan feels that we should limit our presence in the southern and eastern part of Afghanistan and that we should limit our military role there, then I'd like to raise the question of Pakistan's military involvement in Sri Lanka. They are providing arms to Sri Lanka. The Pakistani army chiefs have been going to Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan army chiefs have been visiting Pakistan. It's a very sensitive issue for us because they have been bolstering the capacity of the Sri Lankan government to deal with the Tamilians, and eventually they succeeded in destroying the LTTE, something which we supported. But we have never raised this issue that it's illegitimate for Pakistan to have a military presence in Sri Lanka. Pakistan has a huge embassy in Nepal, which has been used as, from your reports, you will see they've been used it as a conduit for sending in terrorists as well as fake currency into India. This is one of the principal routes. We've not made a big issue of that because that's our problem with Nepal. We have to deal with it. So I think we should not pander to these demands by Pakistan that they have some kind of legitimate oversight over the decisions of third countries in Afghanistan. It is for the Afghanistan government to decide. And it is a failure of Pakistan diplomacy if they cannot persuade the Karzai government and the Afghan government to have good relations with them. It's not our fault.
Thank you, Dr. Kanwal. So last question we'll take, and probably if you could direct to Lisa, that would be great. One of the questions, yeah.
Yeah, Lisa, you talked about this zero option that's been considered since the Taliban opened an office in Qatar, but in January the White House officials were talking about zero option, so it's not related to the blunder in Qatar. Don't you think it appears to be deep in the policies of this administration? And a short question to Secretary Sibal on this military assistance that President Karzai requested a while ago from India. It appears to be turned down by New Delhi. If you have any insights on that to share with us.
Just real quick on the other point, I just wanted to put in my 2 cents that I agree with much of what Kanwal Sibal has said. And, you know, I was in the U.S. administration shortly after 9/11 when this issue came up about the U.S. asking India to close down its consulate in Jalalabad, and you know, just very taken aback by this entire idea, because to me it's foreign policy 101. You don't ask the country that actually supports your interest to draw back its influence in order to placate the other country that's directly undermining your goals in the region. So this does not make sense, I believe. And so I agree with Kanwal Sibal's remarks on that. And getting to your point about the issue of zero troops being an option on the table even before the Doha office, I agree. There are probably some in the White House who, from a political perspective, maybe not understanding the importance of Afghanistan, who may just want to pull out altogether from Afghanistan. I hope that Michael is right, that that's not the preponderant view in the White House, that there is, you know, more of an understanding of the need to keep U.S. troops there after 2014. But I'm sure there are some in the White House who would argue in this favor. And basically what I was saying is that when Karzai was frustrated with how the U.S. handled the opening of the Doha office, pulled out of the bilateral security agreement talks, I think there was a lot of frustration among U.S. officials. And so then they were willing to be more publicly open about the zero option being on the table, simply because they were frustrated with Karzai. And as both Michael and I pointed out, this is really not a sound policy. If you're thinking about what is in the U.S. national security interest, you know, having zero troops in Afghanistan clearly is not in our interest. So it was short-sighted, I think, of the White House to let the zero option get out there merely to try to put pressure on Karzai, and we both argued this wouldn't work in any case. So not a very good strategy, in my opinion.
Very briefly, in my prepared remarks, I wanted to emphasize that our primary goal in Afghanistan is economically oriented. It's not military oriented, because if you have to have a credible Central Asian policy, and this region is very vital for us, even in the context of the growth of Islamist ideologies. We have to be in Afghanistan. If you're not present in Afghanistan, we can't have a Central Asian policy. So we are looking at this in a longer-term integrated way of how we can play a role in this region, especially an economic role, number one. Number two, we have had a long-standing policy of not supplying arms to countries which are in the midst of a civil war or in the midst of a conflict situation, which is why, for example, in Sri Lanka, we've been very, very careful in terms of giving any arms support. In Afghanistan, it's a clear conflict situation, and therefore we are not interested. As a policy issue, it is not possible for us unless we change our formal policy in this regard. Number three, President Karzai would like very much India to bolster Afghanistan by increasing our commitment to Afghanistan through greater arms relationship with Afghanistan. But that may be Karzai's way of thinking, but that's not necessarily what our policy is, and therefore we've been reticent. But in terms of training, we have, in fact, increased the numbers of trainees in India. And then when it comes to, let's say, spare parts for the helicopters or things like that, the Russians are doing that, as you know, in understanding with NATO. So we don't have much of a role there. And let me finally say that with regard to concerns about the Taliban being offered southern and eastern parts of Afghanistan as a price for their cooperation to allow the NATO troops to withdraw honorably. The British roadmap is very clear on this. They have advocated that this should be done, and also that Taliban should be accommodated in the central government, and also should be given a certain number of governorships. And all this without any democratic electoral exercise. I'm glad that the United States has reticence about these plans, but since Britain is a major player in Afghanistan and does consult with the United States side on policy matters, one hopes that British thinking will not succeed in persuading the American side that this might be the best option in terms of withdrawing honorably from Afghanistan.
So thanks, Kanwalji. Generally, I would have asked Michael to respond, but we have such a short of time, so I apologize. So I apologize for that, and thanks everybody. This is has been a very great panel, and I wish we had longer time, so that would have been much more enriching, and you would have had opportunity to ask more questions. But I assure you that the rest of the panels are also very great, and over during the whole day, you will definitely get more insight and more opportunity to participate. Once again, thanks Michael, Lisa, and Kanwalji to grace this panel.